Grimtooth had been laughed at his entire life. The other goblins called him crazy. They said his experiments would blow up the entire mountain. They said he was wasting his time mixing strange liquids in dirty bottles, but Grimtooth never stopped. He had spent 40 years studying the art of potion making, and tonight everything would change. The small green goblin stood in his underground laboratory. The room was carved deep inside the Black Mountain, far away from the goblin city above. Hundreds of bottles lined the stone walls. Strange plants hung from the ceiling. A large cauldron bubbled in the center of the room, releasing purple smoke that smelled like burning metal and rotten eggs. Grimtooth wiped the sweat from his forehead and looked at his notes. The papers were old and torn. Many of them had burn marks from previous failed experiments, but this time was different. This time, he had found the missing ingredient. 3 months ago, a human traveler had passed through goblin territory. The guards had captured him and taken all his belongings. Among his possessions was a small journal filled with strange symbols and drawings. The other goblins had thrown it away, thinking it was garbage. But Grimtooth had rescued it from the trash pile. It took him weeks to understand the human writing. Humans were strange creatures. They came from a planet far across the galaxy. They had arrived on this world only 200 years ago, but they had already changed everything. Their technology was beyond anything the other races had seen. Their knowledge of science made even the elves look like children. The journal belonged to a human scientist who studied something called chemistry. Grimtooth had never heard this word before. Goblins made potions using magic and ancient recipes passed down through generations. But humans made potions using something different. They understood why things exploded. They knew the secrets hidden inside every substance. Grimtooth had combined this human knowledge with his goblin brewing skills. The result was the mixture now bubbling in his cauldron. He called it Thunder's Kiss. The old goblin picked up a wooden spoon and stirred the purple liquid slowly. The mixture began to glow brighter. Small sparks jumped from the surface like tiny lightning bolts. Grimtooth's heart beat faster. This was the moment he had been waiting for his entire life. He carefully poured a small amount of the potion into a glass bottle. The liquid was thick and moved slowly, like honey made of pure energy. Grimtooth sealed the bottle with a cork and held it up to the light. The glow illuminated his wrinkled green face and made his yellow eyes sparkle. Tomorrow was the Grand Council meeting. Representatives from all the races would gather in the Crystal Hall to discuss the growing threat from the Dark Empire. The Orcs had been attacking border villages for months. The elves had lost 3 outposts. Even the dwarves, with their mighty fortresses, were struggling to hold their territory. The Goblin King had sent a message to all goblin inventors and craftsmen. He wanted new weapons, new tools, anything that could help in the coming war. Most goblins had brought simple things like sharpened spears and leather armor. But Grimtooth would bring something that would change history. The next morning, Grimtooth loaded his cart with 20 bottles of Thunder's Kiss. He covered them with thick blankets to protect them from the sunlight. The potion was stable in darkness, but became unstable when exposed to bright light. This was one of the secrets he had learned from the human journal. The journey to the Crystal Hall took 3 days. Grimtooth traveled through dark forests and crossed 2 rivers. He passed through dwarf territory, where the short-bearded warriors looked at him with suspicion. He moved quickly through elf lands, where the tall, graceful beings ignored him completely. Finally, he reached the great valley where the Crystal Hall stood. The building was magnificent. It had been constructed thousands of years ago by an ancient race that no longer existed. The walls were made of pure crystal that sparkled in every color of the rainbow. Towers reached toward the sky like fingers trying to touch the clouds. Representatives from dozens of races were already gathering outside the main entrance. Grimtooth pushed his cart toward the weapons testing area. This was where inventors could demonstrate their creations to the council. A long line of beings waited for their turn. There were dwarves with mechanical crossbows, elves with enchanted arrows, and even a troll carrying a hammer bigger than Grimtooth's entire body. At the front of the line, Grimtooth noticed something unusual. 3 humans stood apart from the others. They wore strange clothing made of materials that seemed to shift and change color. One of them carried a device that looked like a metal tube with glass lenses attached. They were observers sent by the Human Federation to watch the council proceedings. Grimtooth had never seen humans up close before. They were taller than goblins, but shorter than elves. Their skin came in different shades, from pale pink to dark brown. Their eyes showed intelligence and curiosity. One of the humans noticed Grimtooth staring and smiled at him. The goblin quickly looked away. Hours passed before Grimtooth's turn finally came. He pushed his cart to the center of the testing arena. Hundreds of beings watched from the surrounding seats. The Grand Council members sat on elevated thrones, their faces serious and expectant. King Rosgo of the Goblins leaned forward. His crown was too big for his small head and kept sliding down over his eyes. He pushed it back and squinted at Grimtooth. The king asked what the old goblin had brought for the council. Grimtooth bowed deeply and explained that he had created a new type of explosive potion. He called it Thunder's Kiss. One small bottle could destroy an entire enemy fortification. Laughter erupted from the audience. The elves exchanged amused glances. The dwarves shook their heads in disbelief. Even some of the goblins covered their faces in embarrassment. Everyone knew that goblin potions were unreliable at best and completely useless at worst. The elf representative stood up. He was tall and beautiful, with silver hair that flowed like water. He said that goblin explosives had been tested many times before. They produced nothing more than smoke and bad smells. The council's time should not be wasted on such foolishness. Grimtooth felt anger rising in his chest, but he controlled himself. He asked for just one chance to demonstrate. If Thunder's Kiss failed, he would leave immediately and never return. The council members whispered among themselves. Finally, King Rizigal nodded. The goblin would have his chance. A testing target was brought to the arena. It was a thick stone wall, the same type used in military fortifications throughout the realm. Grimtooth examined the wall and nodded. He walked back 50 meters and removed one bottle of Thunder's Kiss from his cart. The arena fell silent. Every eye watched the small green goblin with the glowing bottle. Grimtooth pulled out the cork and threw the potion at the stone wall. For a moment, nothing happened. The bottle shattered against the stone and the purple liquid splashed across the surface. The laughter began again. The elf representative started to speak. Then the explosion came. The sound was like 1,000 thunderstorms happening at once. The stone wall did not just break. It vaporized. A massive crater appeared where the wall had stood. The shockwave knocked beings off their feet throughout the arena. Windows in the crystal hall shattered. The ground shook so violently that some thought it was an earthquake. When the dust cleared, silence filled the arena. Everyone stared at the destruction with wide eyes and open mouths. The stone wall was completely gone. The crater was 10 meters deep and 20 meters wide. Smoke rose from the scorched earth like spirits escaping from the underworld. Grimtooth stood calmly, his hands folded behind his back. His ears were ringing from the noise, but his face showed no emotion. Inside, his heart was dancing with joy. The human observers were the first to react. They rushed forward with their strange devices, taking measurements and recordings. One of them approached Grimtooth and asked how he had created such a powerful explosive. The goblin smiled and said it was a combination of goblin tradition and human science. The human's eyes widened. He asked if Grimtooth had studied human chemistry. The goblin nodded and pulled out the old journal he had found. The human examined it carefully. His face showed surprise and then deep respect. The human explained to his companions what had happened. This goblin had taken basic chemistry principles and combined them with magical brewing techniques. The result was something neither humans nor goblins could have created alone. It was a perfect fusion of two completely different approaches to science. The council members gathered around Grimtooth. The elf representative no longer looked amused. He looked worried. King Rosgel was practically bouncing with excitement. The dwarf lord stroked his beard thoughtfully, already imagining what such explosives could do to orc fortresses. The head of the Grand Council, an ancient dragon who had lived for 10,000 years, descended from his throne. He was massive, covered in golden scales that reflected the light like mirrors. He lowered his enormous head until his eye was level with Grimtooth. The dragon asked if the goblin could produce more of this Thunder's Kiss. Grimtooth said he could make hundreds of bottles if given the proper supplies. The dragon nodded slowly. He declared that the goblin nation would receive full support from the council. Materials, workers, and protection would be provided. Over the following months, Grimtooth's laboratory expanded from a single room to an entire underground complex. Hundreds of goblins worked under his direction, carefully mixing ingredients and filling bottles. Human scientists arrived to study his methods and share their own knowledge. Even some elves swallowed their pride and came to learn. The first major test of Thunder's Kiss in real combat came 6 months later. An orc army of 50,000 soldiers marched toward the dwarf capital. They brought siege weapons and war beasts. They expected an easy victory. They were wrong. Grimtooth himself traveled to the battlefield. He stood on the walls of the dwarf fortress and watched the orc army approach. When they were close enough, he gave the signal. 300 bottles of Thunder's Kiss flew through the air. They had been loaded into specially designed catapults built by dwarf engineers. The bottles sailed over the battlefield like purple stars falling from the sky. The explosions were visible from 50 kilometers away. The orc army ceased to exist in a matter of seconds. The siege weapons became twisted metal. The war beasts became memories. The ground where the army had stood became a smoking wasteland. News of the victory spread across the realm. The Dark Empire paused its advance. For the first time in decades, the free nations had a weapon that could match the enemy's numbers. And it had come from the most unexpected source. Grimtooth returned home as a hero. The goblins who had mocked him now bowed when he passed. Young goblins begged to become his students. The king himself visited the laboratory to shake his hand. But Grimtooth did not care about fame or glory. He returned to his work, mixing new potions and studying new formulas. There was still so much to learn, so much to discover. The human journals had opened the door to a world of knowledge that seemed endless. One evening, the human scientist who had first examined his work came to visit. He brought a gift from the Human Federation. It was a complete collection of chemistry textbooks, translated into the goblin language. Thousands of pages of human scientific knowledge, freely shared. Grimtooth held the books like they were made of gold. He asked why the humans would share such valuable secrets. The human smiled and explained that knowledge grows when it is shared. Humans had learned this lesson long ago on their home world. Progress came from cooperation, not competition. The old goblin nodded slowly. He understood. This was the true lesson of Thunder's Kiss. It was not about explosions or destruction. It was about what could happen when different peoples worked together, when they combined their strengths instead of fighting over their differences. Grimtooth opened the first textbook and began to read. Outside his laboratory, the world was changing, and he was just getting started.